are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Thursday, December 20th, 2018. My name is Michael Brooks, and I'm Michael Thursday, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Kelly Weill. She's a reporter for the Daily Beast. We're talking about the algorithms of the right-wing hate machine online. How does a Google search, a YouTube search on atheism lead you down a treacherous, disgusting path? What's the business model behind it? And of course, we'll probably also dunk on some of these personalities. The ever dumb, ever dim, ever odious Dave Rubin appears on a Bolsonaro-aligned Brazilian network. Speaking of which...
Como se dice fascism?
Como se dice fascism?
Just live ideas.
Yeah, that impression is almost too nice to how absolutely craven, disgusting, and immoral Dave Rubin is. In related Brazil news, a court ruling yesterday from the Supreme Court would have seen the release of political prisoner and former President Lula da Silva, prompting an emergency meeting of the military and an extra-constitutional move by another Supreme Court justice. We'll touch on this case as it illustrates the descent of Brazil to full dictatorship. Donald Trump is pulling out of Syria entirely. He probably had no idea how many troops we had there as he announces a major new arms deal with Erdogan. But what of the Rojava uprising? Something that we're going to need to be thinking about and dealing with after Trump's very characteristically jackass announcement. General Mattis is losing currency in the administration. The Senate passes a stopgap to avert a government shutdown. And the Trump administration aims to toughen work requirements for food stamps because there isn't enough raw human suffering in this country for Republicans. They, of course, need more. Positive news, a judge blocks Jeff Sessions' ridiculous assertion and redefinition of asylum not applying to gang members. A 5-month-old girl has been hospitalized with pneumonia after being detained at the Border Patrol. I guess they want to be being responsible for the negligence and death of many children, apparently. Wilbur Ross twice told federal ethics officials he divested the stock months before he finally did. And here's one breakthrough of Cuba. Major League Baseball reaches a deal with the Cuban Baseball Federation to allow players to enter the United States. I think that's cool. I think that's great. I think that's also an interesting signal of our priorities. All that, plus Bernie Sanders and Dianne Feinstein voiced their opposition to the Senate BDS free speech suppression bill. All that and much, much more on today's Majority Report. Donald Trump yesterday gave me a hashtag resistance moment, which is a moment where I watched Donald Trump say something and I went, I can't believe that this airhead, this buffoon, this moron, this jackass, this dunce, this idiot, this fool is our president. This is so embarrassing. Even when Obama was flying drones everywhere and supporting horrible trade agreements, he carried himself with some friggin' dignity and intelligence. This guy's a moron. I had that resistance moment because Donald Trump announced the end of Syrian military operations the other day, or yesterday, in front of the White House in a brief video. Now, there's multiple fronts of U.S. kinetic activity. In fact, at least 7 countries, the U.S. under Trump, are regularly hitting with drone strikes rules and caps on civilian casualties are completely out the window. Already many civilians, of course, died as the Obama administration continued the essential infrastructure of the Bush global war on terrorism and expanded it in Yemen, Somalia, and other places. But Trump has totally lifted all caps. So we've seen massive increases in civilian casualties and the use of drones since he's taken office. Of course, Afghanistan, we've been there longer than in Vietnam. No end in sight for that brutal, pernicious war. And yet we're pulling entirely out of Syria, which we almost entirely should. However, there is one big question mark around this, and also a legacy of our own massive contribution to the civilian death toll in Syria, as well as funding through the Gulf of Salafist groups, that, of course, Trump is not only going to ignore here, he's going to go off in a very weird and, frankly, disrespectful to our troops tangent. Here is the moron that runs this country yesterday talking about withdrawing from Syria.
We've been fighting for a long time in Syria. I've been president for almost 2 years, and we've really stepped it up. And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly. We've taken back the land, and now it's time for our troops to come back home. I get very saddened when I have to write letters or call parents or wives or husbands of soldiers who have been killed fighting for our country. It's a great honor. We cherish them, but it's heartbreaking. There's no question about it. It's heartbreaking.
Jesus.
Now we've won. It's time to come back. They're getting ready. You're going to see them soon. These are great American heroes. These are great heroes of the world because they fought for us, but they've killed ISIS, who hurts the world, and we're proud to have done it. And I'll tell you, they're up there looking down on us, and there is nobody happier or more proud of their families to put them in a position where they've done such good for so many people.
I really feel like the whole subtext of this video is he's trying to get out from having to call dead soldiers' families. He's like, what if I really put it out in the video that this is really super bad? Then can I skip the calls?
It's so heartbreaking.
So heartbreaking. So I do believe it's anxiety inducing for him. I mean, this is a guy who's like freaked out by stairs. I could only imagine it's freaky to call the family of a loved one who's died overseas in a unnecessary U.S. imperial adventure.
You still support my presidency, right?
Right. You still sorry about your son. Besides that, how would you say I'm doing on economy?
You know, your son had loyalty. That's what I respect.
Yes, I respect that because they do this thing where they make people unloyal for the FBI and Comey.
When he first got into office and there was an attack over there where a few soldiers died, didn't he like promise to donate a certain amount of money to one of the soldiers' like memorial funds?
Checks
and like
in the
never
mail.
did it and was
Checks
like,
in the mail.
I can imagine being like, listen, I can't keep making this many promises.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to lie to a couple of dozen soldiers' families that you're going to help a funeral cost, but by the time you get into the thousands, I mean, that's a lot of IOUs that are never going to be
My charity's
cashed.
gone, folks.
It's so heartbreaking the way they make me turn off Fox and Friends when I have to write these letters.
Which I definitely write myself.
And by the way, in full resistance mode, his hands actually legit are small. Like, I've never, honestly, like, I thought it was funny because it bothered him so much.
He looks like a
but
Cheeto.
He looks like a Cheeto.
I was going to say, it's Kofi Annan.
Yeah, Kofi Annan. How does it feel to have your sleepover with Putin?
You know,
You are nothing.
I was looking at Rick Wilson's
Everyone
book because they
is-
sent it to us for some reason. And
Rick Wilson is a patriot.
the last line is, and by the way, he has small hands. No way. I swear to God. Yeah.
Saw a guy reading that outside the park at the end of the summer, just like getting both sides.
Liberals are such easy marks. Could you imagine? This guy builds his whole... Rick Wilson is a Republican strategist who's built his whole career on electing people to office that are forwarding and advancing all of the policies that Donald Trump is putting into play. And it's like a whole... there's a whole bunch of people who could just be like, hey, you know what? I appreciate, Rick, that you get that overt racism and misogyny isn't great. Thanks. And we'll take it from here. Instead, this guy gets to become a celebrity on the weight of tweeting against Donald Trump after a year of damaging American life. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, so the last two paragraphs are he leaves with a Churchill quote, which I'm not going to bother to read,
Jesus,
and then
skip it.
Also, Trump has tiny, tiny hands.
Shut the fuck up. Shut up. Ugh. I hope Trump roasts him. I hope Trump gets it. I hope that I hope Trump loses, gets indicted, and then in the brief interim before he goes to jail, he gets an opportunity to do like a final roast of like people like Rick Wilson before they take down his Twitter.
That's how he wins 2020.
That's the terrifying scenario.
Yeah, just roasts Rick Wilson.
If he could just lean into David Frum and Rick Wilson, he has a chance. But look, there's a serious thing here. Just concluded a great interview with Samuel Moyn, which I'll talk about more later. He wrote a really important book called "Not Enough: Human Rights in the Age of Inequality," and we have been exiting this myth of humanitarian interventionism and realizing that the rhetoric of human rights has served as a proxy for U.S. foreign policy interests, and it's been applied in not only a radically inconsistent way, but also has led to, at least partially, to horrific atrocities like the invasion of Iraq and disasters like the assault on Libya. In Syria, there's a multi-party civil war. Nobody likes the reality of this. Every single party involved in Syria is responsible for a massive civilian death toll. Assad, the forces that back Assad, including, of course, Russia and Iran, as well as the United States and its Gulf allies. And then ISIS is a connected somewhat to Turkey in the Gulf and in some respects its own sort of entity, but it couldn't have risen, I think, clearly without some forms of support from the Gulf and Turkey. I don't see how that would be possible. And they commit massive atrocities. The Kurds in Rojava have an anarchist, confederalist experiment. It's one that is global in its implications because of the success of the model and things that we should all be learning from it. And it's also a part of a justified struggle for Kurdish autonomy and determination. And nobody should oppose that, period. Of course, it doesn't mean everybody condemns any type of attack on Turkish civilians and any type of terrorist activity. 100%, of course. But the Kurds are absolutely right about their repression in both Iraq, Turkey, and elsewhere. And they've been able to carve out a very respectable, laudable experiment here, as well as be incredible effective fighters against ISIS and holding off a genocidal Turkish campaign, which is really what it will be. Now, there are about 2,000 U.S. forces in that region that have already begun withdrawals. In conjunction with this withdrawal, Trump just inked a $3.5 billion missile sale agreement to Turkey, which includes 80 Patriot missiles and 60 PAC-3 missile interceptors. Russia has also negotiated a separate deal with Turkey as well. There's no doubt that part of the adroit play that Erdogan had, putting pressure on MBS and humiliating the Saudis after their torture and murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, helped facilitate this move on Trump's part. So this is a very important time to, on the merits, be supportive of a broader withdrawal, but also realize that there's going to be some immediate humanitarian consequences to a precipitous one. First and foremost, the betrayal of the Kurds of Rojava, which of course the U.S. were never serious allies of in any way to begin with. But just as I'm a fierce opponent of many aspects of Russian foreign policy, of course U.S. foreign policy, but I'll tell you what, if Russia building more investment in relationships with Venezuela, as an example, helps see off a U.S. coup, that's a good thing, right? So there was a function of U.S. presence there was supporting a noble, correct, and right experiment. And the Turkish government is already talking about hunting people down ditch to ditch and waging a campaign of mass murder in this region. I don't know the answer to this. I just know the complexity of it. And I know that we should certainly still be fueling the Kurds in Rojava with weapons. We should certainly still, I would, if I were president, I would keep some presence there. And I would keep some intelligence and logistical support. And we need to not go into despair. We need to affirm our solidarity. And I'll be doing a lot more coverage on this. But I do want to put that one piece of the real complexity on the table. All right. Today's show is brought to you by privacy.com/majority. Privacy.com is a totally free service that lets you buy anything online without having to give out a credit card number, and it lets you prevent companies from overcharging you. Here's how it works. I'm incredibly excited about this. You just take a couple of minutes to link your bank account to your privacy.com account. And then you're able to create virtual credit card numbers which are linked to your bank account. You can create as many virtual cards as you want. You can delete them, you can freeze them and unfreeze them, and you can set limits on each card. It's great for signing up for free trials because you can just create a virtual card once and delete it, knowing that you'll never be charged once the trial is over. And it protects you when companies get hacked and people's information is stolen because you're not giving out your real credit card number. Equifax, everyone. Each card is locked to a merchant, so you're totally protected against fraud and unauthorized use of your card. Privacy.com's mobile app and desktop browser extension make it incredibly easy to manage your wallet of virtual cards and allow you to autofill your virtual cards at the click of the button when you're shopping online. There are countless different advantages to using services like this to pay your bills and buy things online. You can find out more and get 100% free and unlimited access by going to privacy.com/majority, and we've put a link underneath this video if you're watching on YouTube. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Kelly Weill. Welcome back to the Majority Report. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is Kelly Weill. She is a reporter for the Daily Beast. Kelly, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Kelly, you cover some of the worst swamps of the internet for the Daily Beast, and you've written a new piece called "How to Build a Radicalization Machine for the Far." How YouTube built a radicalization machine for the far right. Start us off by explaining how, and it would almost certainly be a young man, would start an internet search for, say, I don't know, why Christianity isn't real, or why religion is wrong, or, how to be an atheist. How does that search end up through algorithms and through symbiotic networks, in many cases, lead to a path towards white nationalism, as an example?
Right. So you have to understand that YouTube has this algorithm that recommends things that it thinks you want to watch, because the longer you're on the site, the more money you're making for them through ad placement. So there's nothing inherently wrong with, say, religious debate videos or atheism videos, but there's a kind of reactionary undercurrent in some of the atheist community online, where they don't just talk about religion, they also talk about anti-feminism. Sometimes there's Islamophobic strains to it. So because there is that tie, sometimes when you're watching an atheist video, you'll get recommendations for things that are more fringe on the right. And if you click on that, it'll recommend the next fringe idea until you can find yourself quite far into the weeds. And I think for people who this process happens on slowly, they don't even realize how far they've gone.
Can you talk about this kid, 15-year-old David Sherritt, as a sort of case study in what you're talking about?
Yeah, so David started watching actually Call of Duty videos when he was about 15. And that's really common for especially young men. And he said from there he started getting recommendations for religious debate. That's a really popular genre on YouTube, so it's not really that surprising that he may have seen it. And from there, he went from atheism videos to anti-feminist videos, which really kind of brought him into the overall genre of videos that are opposed to social justice. And he fortunately was able to kind of snap out of that last year. He's no longer in that circle, but a lot of young men don't find their way out.
And so from a business perspective, because I think in some ways we need to start like reshaping the debate to be about these platforms themselves and the functions they're actually serving or not serving writ large. You get more specifically into this sort of like, you quote Becca Lewis, who's a researcher at Data and Society, and she says, fixation on watch time can be banal or dangerous in terms of, excuse me, that's you. Now this is Becca Lewis. In terms of YouTube's business model and attempts to keep users engaged in their content, it makes sense that what we're seeing the algorithms do. The algorithmic behavior is great if you're looking for makeup artists and you watch one person's content and want a bunch of other people's advice on how to do your eyeshadow. But it becomes a lot more problematic when you're talking about political and extremist content. Now, I guess my question for you is, obviously, you know, just as like a simple statement about content, of course that's true, right? Like if you're following makeup tutorials or sports highlights, that's obviously way more innately positive and less dangerous than, you know, watching misogynistic videos as an example. But the broader sort of like environment we're in of these really tightly sort of self-reinforcing feedback loops with no governmental oversight or regulation on consumer protection, on people's data. You know, people have called Silicon Valley the stalker economy. There's this sort of like broader infrastructure, and it's not even as simplistic as just like, oh, you don't want to just reinforce your political biases, because that conversation I think gets really simplistic too. But just this idea that you are literally cocooning small groups and individuals as much as possible purely to target them products and make money off of them and then just create more information out of them to keep the process going. And I'm just wondering, like, as you research this and you saw like the context of the problem, did her frame there that like, oh, there's nothing wrong with the algorithms, it's just like the content? Did you start to call that into question a little bit maybe? Because it seems like if that's the only thing that we're using and there's no oversight, there's no regulation, there's no control, I don't see how it could not help but feed these kind of problems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's different degrees to which this works. I mean, it is in YouTube's interest to keep you online as long as possible. And I think as you go into more extreme filter bubbles, it actually becomes more profitable for YouTube. If you look at conspiracy communities, YouTubers will say, oh, don't look at other news sources because they're lying to you. Just stay on YouTube and watch more YouTube videos. And that's great for YouTube's economy. So I don't think the same phenomena is exactly in effect with makeup tutorials. But I mean, I think one problem we have is sort of a monopoly right now in terms of these vast digital platforms. There's really no one competing with YouTube. And so everyone should have, you know, the consumer choice to watch, you know, makeup videos or atheist videos if you'd like. But the problem is that all of those choices we make are being funneled back through the same website, which is using it to learn about us, to probably calibrate the algorithm. So there is a degree to which that's troubling. And in fact, I spoke to a YouTube, one of the former employees who helped write that algorithm and who now sort of regrets elements of it. And he said that YouTube's problem isn't so much a content problem as it is an algorithm problem. No matter what, if you have a platform that large, there will be extremist content on it probably, but what we can do is to stop it recommending those videos so highly.
So let's talk specifically about the pipelines and how they work now in terms of the content, less of the algorithms, and this pipeline process. And specifically, I want to talk about these characters that are like conduit characters, like Dave Rubin, as an example. Unfortunately, I mean, I like him a lot more as a broadcaster. I get dinged for saying this, but Joe Rogan definitely serves a very similar role. He does a better show, but there's this sort of like people who at least are branded as being kind of like broad, general, sort of middle-of-the-road content. Like some people, like with Rogan, some people jokingly call him like Bro Oprah. Actually facilitating through their guest selection and their sort of like who they're building like symbiotic relationships with, the sort of departure points to the more really far-right content. One glaring example of this, and I think people should really think about when some academic like Steve Pinker, who has all this brand prestige, does a friendly sit-down with Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin had on, the very fringe, very dangerous, extreme character, Stefan Molyneux, and literally the name of the show, I believe, is Race and IQ, or something like Race and Brain Science. And he gave him a several-hour platform to uncritically promote racist IQ ideas. How does this process work in terms of like how these people build relationships with each other and how that sort of gradual facilitation to the greater extremism starts, but particularly through those conduits like Dave Rubin?
Right. I think those conduits are running a really good scam in that they present themselves as neutral, or even they'll say they're liberal, they're class liberal, which means next to nothing.
Right.
But because
it means you're being disingenuous. Sorry, yeah.
Yes.
Right.
But because they present themselves as these just open platforms, and I think we have a really fundamental misunderstanding of how conversation and conversion works right now, where we seem to say, well, if you just hear all sides, if you just have a debate, then the best idea will win. That's not how it works at all. Right. But because we sort of start from that misinformed standpoint, people like Dave Rubin can present themselves as neutral, as saying, well, I'm just, hosting everyone and I'll let my very smart viewers figure it out. Well, no, I mean, I think in a healthy information economy, you don't come across people who are pushing, bunk race science and stuff like that. And what's also interesting is you mentioned that Stefan Molyneux interview. I had to watch it once because I think I was like quoting it for something to, I think, point out that Stefan Molyneux has really problematic views. And ever since, for about 6 months, it has come up at the top of my recommendation feed in YouTube. So something in that algorithm is really, it's weighting that kind of video very highly. And I think that's something that the supposedly neutral conduits should take into account when they host these people, is that they are introducing this new quantity to an ostensibly neutral viewership, and it's going to stick around. It's going to be really influential for people.
100%. So, okay, so this is, then how does that implicate, like, even people who have prestige outside of YouTube? That's why I mentioned Steve Pinker, or someone like Sam Harris, who, in my mind, I mean, Sam Harris is definitely best understood as a podcast host, YouTube pundit of this sort of, weird, disingenuous right wing and, kind of obsessed with IQ and Islam sort of milieu. But he also has established a certain degree of prestige off of the platform that someone like Dave Rubin does not have. And then, of course, you have someone like, Barry Weiss writing these, breathless, incredulous pieces in the New York Times. And so that kind of like broader branding effort has been pushed out into a broader public. Like, what do you think, like, in terms of the intellectual accountability for people like that. So that, like, someone like Steve Pinker, as an example, should at least know or have it clearly registered, like, hey, one of the prime platforms you went on YouTube to promote your book as a Harvard professor and so on is a credulous sort of promoter of bigotry through various guests. He has on other guests who seem to be almost like Sacha Baron Cohen level, sort of like fraudulent characters on their face. Like, and that would be a best case scenario, because it would be better if they didn't exist and they were actually literal jokes. Or Barry Weiss, for that matter, writing this piece in the New York Times, like, oh my God, all of these actually pretty turgid old right-wing ideas rebranded for the YouTube age are somehow this, incredibly brave culture. And then that's actually the main conduit that they get out into an audience even offline.
Yeah, I think it lends a real veneer of credibility and intellectualism to a movement that is right now very largely based in YouTube. And personally, I like YouTube. I don't think we should completely discredit it as, as a source of thought, but a lot of people do. And, we've seen this time and time throughout history, and I'm going to do the terrible thing where I reference the Nazis, but I know a lot about them, is that, one way that they were able to take this horrible ideology from, just street thuggery and things that were floating around in fringe newspapers into the mainstream is just having a few intellectuals on their side. Not necessarily good writers. Barry Weiss isn't a good writer, but people who could at least give them, give them the look of someone that you could take seriously. And I think that's what these intellectuals are doing, consciously or not.
I want to talk about deplatforming, and we might have a difference of opinion on this, but it's just been a conversation that's been floating. And I mean, first of all, actually, would you say that there's a difference that we can actually work out really sharply between, say, as an example, I guess I'll put it to you really simply, and not only do I loathe Sargon, I actually did a debate with Sargon, which is one of the more sort of odd, unpleasant experiences of my life, mainly because I did have a bunch of really enraged, I'm definitely assuming young virgins, ranting at me for days online afterwards. But that being said, what he got kicked off of Patreon for, which we can get into in a second, and then someone like Laura Southern, who got kicked off of Patreon, she, had left any recognizable realm of speech. She was literally using that platform to get money to do some type of like grassroots flotilla effort to terrorize migrants, if I recall correctly. That absolutely steps into, action, right? So my concern about the deplatforming, though, goes back to this broader concern and critique of these tech companies, which is that, okay, there are these headlines that someone like Gavin McInnes or Alex Jones have lost their platform. And in and of themselves, great. I don't care. I don't have some sort of romantic fixation about these people being able to say what they want to say, and they can in other ways. Whatever. Screw them. Screw Sargon too. Now, that said, I don't trust private platforms who I don't think should have, frankly, this amount of power to begin with over our public discourse in an unaccountable way, to be the arbiters in an intelligent way of who should and shouldn't speak. So in Facebook, as an example, the headlines are they got rid of Alex Jones and Gavin McInnes. Sure, great, whatever. But the greater structural excluding of voices is hitting news services like Telesaur, as an example, which, one can think what they want of Telesaur, but Telesaur is a very, is a real, credible, certainly left-leaning, but important news source in Latin America. And Facebook is, working with, center-right think tanks in Washington, D.C. to create standards of what should and shouldn't be posted. And so my concern about deplatforming more broadly is that instead of having a conversation about how to potentially nationalize companies that need to be nationalized, or strongly, robustly regulate them so that there can be serious public oversight over these companies, or these companies having ombudsmen that can actually like recognize that these companies are journalistic platforms, frankly. It's going to be left to companies that hold a huge amount of power over the public discourse, don't have any commitment to the public good. In fact, as witnessed by your great reporting on how they have helped facilitate this horrific far-right machine on YouTube. And they will sort of push and pull between various types of public sentiments, which will, sure, get rid of some awful people, but also implicate a much broader ability for people to do anything critical or rigorous or adversarial. So that instead of worrying about deplatforming people, we need to worry about the types of structural reforms that can make these platforms actually accountable and non-monopolistic. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It does make sense. And
Yeah.
I think there's two main concerns. I think as we talk about the really far right, and you brought up a great example of Lauren Southern
Yes.
crowdfunding for boats in the Mediterranean that would harass migrants.
Gotta go. Different
yeah.
thing. Yes.
Yep. And so when we talk about that, activists talk about, preventing harm in the immediate sense. And in that case, deplatforming, it works. We've seen that when people get kicked off platforms, they lose audience. Right now, the whole far right is looking for an alternative to Patreon. They're not really finding it yet. So as we've seen so far, it works. And depending on your standpoint, whether you think that is the prerogative of just, trying to reduce immediate harm, that's a standpoint some people have. But I think you're really right to bring up the idea of monopoly in these tech companies, and they do not have our public interest at heart. So I think when we talk about deplatforming, we do need to talk about having some broader oversight. And there's different ways you can approach that. One is the idea of nationalization, having a large overseeing body, one that hopefully has, some ideological diversity, that has, public accountability, that isn't locked away in a boardroom that we don't know who's discussing what and who has what financial aims. But there's also the idea of breaking up the monopoly. Right now, Facebook, forget Facebook being the largest social network. It's what you log into everything with. It has its tendrils everywhere. So I think right now, as people try and distance themselves from these platforms, we're realizing how few alternatives we have. And I think in the immediate sense, maybe it would be worthwhile coming up with more social networks, and maybe those individual ones that could have their standards. I think maybe we give large platforms too much credit and say, well, if you ban this one person, it's a slippery slope. I'm kind of a moral purist, and I say they should be able to recognize, who's a Nazi, and I don't want them personally on my page. So maybe that is the work of alternative social networks in the future.
Yeah, I think there's a part of right, like, great, bring on the left wing Patreon, and I won't share audience with share platform with Dave Rubin. Sounds good to me. But my last question, I guess, is also fairly broad, and I'm curious your thoughts on this too, obviously, which is part of what sucks and is so disheartening about this is it definitely means that, and I think this is one of these weird, like, even just difference between being like in your 30s versus your 20s, right? Which is like just a sense that if you grew up at a certain time, that it wasn't that we didn't have a really broad public debate, and there weren't a lot of things on the table, but that there were certain things that really were closed. And I don't mean closed like in the easy examples that these guys can jump in on, like, here's an example of a college student being ridiculous about a joke or something. I'm not talking about that. But that there were real things that we had agreed both empirically, like the Holocaust happened, and also like morally, right? Like civil rights as an example. And it doesn't mean that in any way there wasn't a massive amount, like this, profound racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and ahistoricity, all of that, of course. But it's sort of, I guess what it is it's had enough success where they've put certain questions back into play. And I feel like part of the impulse that people like us have is like, no, we're not going to relitigate this. Like, people have literally died for these things. But they might have done enough, as an example, that like I needed to do IQ content a while ago because they put it enough on the table that you needed to respond to it because they were able to exploit, like, see, we're having a quote-unquote rational conversation. All the left has is moral condemnation. Where do you think the line is between holding the line that, no, some things are and should be settled questions versus, taking up battles that we might have already thought we've won, but realizing that first of all, weren't really won to begin with and then have been reopened in a different way by these pernicious people?
Yeah, I think one reason we're seeing this reopen is kind of because of tech companies.
Yep.
And I think right now, due to filter bubbles, due to these sort of opt-in communities, people can sort of choose their own reality. So ideas that, listen, a normal person has to choose their morals and their set of facts. And for any kind of mental stability, those things can't always be in flux. And I think that's good. There are certain established facts. I wrote about the flat earth community recently, and I'm not going to have a debate with them over whether the earth is flat. It's not. So you do have to draw the line somewhere. I think one issue, though, with our social media environment is that you can go so far down these rabbit holes, sometimes led by algorithm or just by, curiosity, that your set of empirical facts starts to change. Mm-hmm. And so I think this idea, we're bringing it into debate. We've seen that that presenting things as a debate with two sides is not always fair. It's not always objective, and these two sides don't need to be in debate. And Holocaust denial is a great example of something that objectively happened, and that even having the debate is dangerous. It loosens this, I think, our sense of social responsibility, and it really enables people with hateful ideologies to move it a bit further. So you talk about like where to draw the line. I think everyone should be educated, but I think we need to understand that this shifting line isn't the line of objective facts. It's the place that these communities are leading us deliberately, and it's not going to stop just at that line. It's going to move. If you go to meet it, it's going to move on to the next and most extreme idea.
Kelly Weill, I really appreciate your time. The piece is Inside YouTube's Far-Right Radicalization Factory. Read it at the Daily Beast. Kelly, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks. We are going to go to the fun half. Before we do that, become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. And you get the Just Coffee deal. Subscribe if you haven't yet on YouTube. And on iTunes. What are we doing tomorrow? I know we're doing a show, but do we know what we have in store for tomorrow?
Just the end of the year wrap up.
Last
show of 2018. Live show of 2018.
And I know on Monday, it was very fun. I was not, but Alex Perrine and Sam were sipping some scotch, and the three of us, along with Matt, dropping in from time to time, did a very fun year-round roundup, which is going to play on Monday. Tonight, the last show of the Michael Brooks Show of 2018. Big Was, Will Sneelon Braze in studio. We are going to have an incredibly fun time, as you would imagine. We're going to play a clip of this in the fun half. Speaking of algorithms, okay, everything that we cover, whether it's on this show or my show, is... even if it's on the just, Trump is a jackass side of the equation, or here's Dave Rubin just acting like a complete, total breathtaking moron.
Oh no, I got trapped in an algorithm and sent to Brazil.
No, I got trapped in an algorithm and sent to Brazil. Actually, yeah, let's play that in a second because that fits nicely. But they all matter. It matters to dunk on Dave Rubin to some degree, sometimes to a significant degree. But you do have these moments, and it's like, I get it. I understand, like, eating your vegetables. But, like, basically, we did an exclusive interview with Lula's lawyer, and more people need to watch that because that's, like, a really big deal.
This is just honeypot stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff, like, guys, like, we'll get to it more in the fun half, but it isn't just obviously enormous personal admiration for the guy, but this is a case study and an opening not only for the destruction of Brazil, but it actually has pretty far-reaching consequences for how we think of lawfare, for U.S. foreign policy, and even for like the prospects of the types of politics you're interested in to some degree if you're watching this show, most likely. So go on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel and watch the interview with Valeska Martins and share it because it's could not be of more importance and it matters. We are, in fact, literally global citizens. There are still tickets left, although they're picking up again for the Michael Brooks Show at live show at the Bell House, February 1st in Brooklyn. We'll talk about that more later. Get your tickets. Subscribe to the Michael Brooks Show on Patreon, patreon.com/TMBS. Also, at 6 o'clock, I should have said this before, a little past 7, the regular full show, Waz is going to be in. At 6, we're doing a live stream with Jean Bajlan, Kurdish academic, on the situation in Rojava in light of this pullout. All right. Matt.
My Anne Bradstreet. Also, we talk about Anne Hutchinson. I don't know if you guys are very familiar with Anne
I know
Hutchinson.
the name, but I don't know anything.
That's interesting to me because she's sort of a Massachusetts Bay. She was an early freedom of conscious person. She was sort of like, she came over basically to follow John Cotton. I always make that mistake. To follow
She
John
was not
Cotton,
following Tom Cotton.
a preacher.
She was not following the guy who looks like he has scurvy and advocates for war.
And she was like, she's very like well read about the Bible and stuff. And then shortly she started doing her own Bible studies. And the men and a whole bunch of people, men and women, would go to her house for these like, I compare them to like Talking Dead, like sort of commentaries on the sermons.
That's really interesting.
And then the men were like, "We need to shut this down." But anyway, that's
fascinating.
Yeah, that's
I wonder if that had an indirect influence on the Transcendentalists.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think they a lot of them talk about her, but that was the context for Anne Bradstreet writing her poetry, and she was very concerned about not being hunted like a witch, because that was basically a witch hunt. And later those would be literal witch hunts, but Anne Hutchinson was sort of because it was about spiritual things too, and people talked, well, maybe she thought that God convinced her to come to America, and then after things went poor, she got exiled to Rhode Island, and she had this is how the Puritans were, like, she had a deformed child, and they're like, well, see, it was Satan that convinced you to come to America, and this is the proof of that. So yeah, pretty crazy stuff in the colonial era.
Literary hangover.
That's available for members. It's going to be unlocked for everybody on Saturday.
Get your literary hangover. Let's do this in the in the first half, actually. Let's do this because I had set it up. I get afraid sometimes that for all the time we spend talking about how stupid Dave Rubin is, we don't talk about what an asshole he also is. Also a very genuinely bad person. And, the hustle in the United States is, the far right or the new centrists, the far right or the new libertines, and so on. And that isn't true, obviously, first of all, is evidenced by the fact that they aren't across the board ardent free speech advocates in the old ACLU model, which I have a lot of respect for. It's evident in the fact that they never talk about any serious policy issues. It's all just sort of circle jerks about Twitter controversies and other relatively inconsequential things. And it's glaringly evident when, as an example, Dave Rubin, is planning apparently on voting for Donald Trump for president. That should sort of show the store. But this is another level here. This is actually incredible. This is Dave Rubin appearing on the pro-Bolsonaro YT channel in Brasilia, Brasilia Paralelo. And just to be clear, Jair Bolsonaro, in addition to promising savage austerity, pension cuts, labor cuts, abuses of the poor and vulnerable of Brazil, and carrying out the interests of Western corporate interests, which obviously there's no controversy about that. We've all seen Dave talk about Amazon. The Koch brothers are plugged into, the sort of air vacuums in his head about these things. But he has said a lot that, never gets tired of mentioning he's a gay man, and never gets tired of saying that he, opposes identity politics. Well, Bolsonaro has talked about beating his kid if he was gay. His sons and people affiliated with him have celebrated the assassination of Marielle Franco, who was a lesbian city councilwoman. And this is a government that is not only neo-fascist, incoming neo-fascist government, it's in no way hiding the ball on its plans for a ruthless, vicious social agenda, including increasing police violence. So it's a good example, though, of the reciprocity of media, because these people are going to take on the latest trends of the extreme right in the United States. That's why you have a cabinet ministers in the Bolsonaro government who talk about cultural Marxism, the old John Birch Society conspiracy theory, which has been recycled into Jordan Peterson. And now here's Dave Rubin, the classical liberal, helping spread propaganda for a regime that is literally promising to ban protests, which some might consider a form of free speech, and is celebrated mass killings.
We have a very similar problem that you guys have in Brazil. I mean, the media has basically lost all credibility. The line that I like to say is that many, if not most journalists, they're not journalists anymore, they're activists.
Já não restam dúvidas de que aqueles em posição de nos orientar no
mundo
abandonaram a sua missão.
Coming back, there's going to be more of this idiot.
Aqueles que concentram o poder sobre o povo. Os fatos viraram meias verdades. Importam muito.
That's not news. What is news really is what's really happening in culture. What are people really thinking about?
A mídia tradicional está com os dias contados.
I love how, even when you're trying to do, a serious, actually, this is a really bad guy clip, which Dave Rubin is an incredibly bad, disgusting, morally vacant person, he's just so stupid that it's hard not to laugh. But, no, I can't take any more. If you have any, even cursory knowledge of modern Brazil, you know that the entire of mainstream Brazilian media, including state media, was ruthlessly opposed to Dilma Rousseff and Lula da Silva, and have spread every matter of rumor and innuendo about the Workers' Party, covered Bolsonaro with kid gloves. The Wall Street Journal endorsed him. The Brazilian mainstream press either endorsed him or treated him with kid gloves. And they all supported a extrajudicial coup that removed Dilma. That actually, in his dim-witted way, I mean, that's just a big lie. That is actually literally fascistic big lie. That isn't even that's wrong on the merits because you have to consider this news source. It's no, the Brazilian media was uniformly and ruthlessly committed to destroying democratically elected governments of Dilma and Lula. And in the last couple of weeks of the runoff, they may have or before the runoff, because by the time the runoff happened, they consolidated behind the fascist Bolsonaro. They may have ran a few pieces being like, hey, this Bolsonaro guy, when he said that, Afro-Brazilians are inferior, or people around him talked about killing gay people, or the plans to hand guns to everybody so they can kill people, or the proposals that police should be able to shoot people in favelas without any legal consequences. Maybe that's a little bit. And, this story of somebody from a supporter of his carving a swastika into a teenage girl's stomach. We should look into that. Or even what happened 2 weeks ago, which was 2 members of the landless movement literally being gunned down at a camp. Those things, and that wasn't covered in mainstream Brazilian media at all. So Dave Rubin, dishonest, horrible person. I'm sure he's too stupid to know and doesn't care.
How am I supposed to know what's going on in Brazil? I just want to know the ideas that
I just
they're
want to know
talking
the
about.
ideas. I mean, they were saying that the ideas that there was a lot of ideas going on, and that Bolsonaro was interested in ideas. Bolsonaro has one of Bolsonaro's main advisors, and I'm going to be looking into this more, is a Brazilian who lives in exile who writes in Virginia and believes that cultural Marxism is destroying the planet and is a former astrologer. And he is one of the main intellectual architects and ideas man, along with, of course, Pinochet advising Milton Friedman-style Wall Street advisors who are going to ram through destroying labor protections. And I'm sure, of course, Dave Rubin doesn't know any of that, but he doesn't care to know.
Sounds very interesting to me, though.
Oh, whoa, astrology. Whoa, oh boy.
Astrology and hard right politics?
Astrology and hard
My
right
ears
politics.
are burning.
My ears are burning. Wow. Give you a little tutorial on how to suck money out of insecure weird men on the internet. Disgusting. These people are disgusting, loathsome.
Fascist propagandists.
Fascist propagandists. They're disgusting, grotesque, loathsome people. We'll see you on the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.